On a cold November afternoon, an 82-year-old grandmother stepped onto her front porch carrying nothing but a faded brown suitcase and an old leather photo album that looked almost as worn as the hands holding it. Her name was Eleanor Brooks, and for more than 40 years, she had quietly called that modest house home. She wasn't leaving because she wanted a fresh start. She wasn't moving to be closer to family. She was being thrown out by the very people she had sacrificed everything to protect. Across the street, curtains moved as neighbors peeked through their windows. Some lowered their eyes. Others whispered to one another. A few looked genuinely heartbroken, but no one crossed the street. No one offered to carry her suitcase. No one asked if she had somewhere safe to sleep that night. They assumed this was simply another sad family disagreement that didn't concern them. What they couldn't possibly imagine was that, within days, the same family that had closed the door behind Eleanor would be desperately searching every shelter, every church, and every hospital in town, hoping they could find the woman they had just abandoned. Because Eleanor wasn't just another forgotten grandmother. She had spent decades protecting a secret so extraordinary that, once it surfaced, it would change the future of an entire neighborhood forever. Most people believe wealth announces itself with luxury cars, sprawling mansions, expensive watches, or vacations splashed across social media. Eleanor believed the exact opposite. She spent her life convincing the world she was ordinary. She drove the same aging sedan for nearly 20 years, clipped grocery coupons every Sunday afternoon, wore coats long after they had gone out of style, and volunteered quietly at local churches without ever expecting recognition. Even her own son, Jason Brooks, believed his mother had little more than a modest retirement account and a small house she refused to leave. His wife, Melissa Brooks, saw Eleanor as an aging burden standing between them and the financial future they desperately wanted. Neither of them ever questioned why banks greeted Eleanor by name, why respected attorneys occasionally stopped by for short private visits, or why longtime business owners across town smiled with unusual respect whenever they saw her. Those details never seemed important, until the afternoon they forced her out of her own home. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. As Eleanor slowly walked toward the end of the driveway, she paused only once. She turned back and looked at the house where she had raised her son, buried her husband, celebrated birthdays, mourned losses, and quietly built a life that no one, not even the people closest to her, had ever truly understood. There were no angry words, no desperate pleas, no threats. She simply adjusted the handle of her worn suitcase, held the photo album tightly against her chest, and whispered something so softly that no one standing nearby could hear it. Then she continued walking without looking back. Inside the house, Jason believed the hardest part was finally over. Melissa was already discussing renovation ideas and imagining the profit they would make after selling the property. They smiled with relief, convinced they had solved their financial problems in a single afternoon. They had no idea that the decision they celebrated would soon become the greatest mistake of their lives, because the woman disappearing down that quiet suburban street wasn't leaving with nothing. She was walking away with a secret that had been hidden for more than 4 decades. And when that secret finally came to light, everything they believed they owned would suddenly belong to someone else. Eleanor Brooks had never asked anyone to feel sorry for her. At 82 years old, she had lived long enough to understand that the loudest people were rarely the strongest, and that the greatest acts of kindness were often the ones no one ever noticed. To most of the neighborhood, she was simply the quiet widow who waved from her front porch every morning, baked peach pies for church fundraisers, and remembered every child's birthday long after they had grown into adults with families of their own. She dressed modestly, drove an aging sedan that most people assumed should have been replaced years earlier, and carried herself with a quiet grace that had earned the respect of neighbors who had known her for decades. If someone's furnace broke in the middle of winter, Eleanor somehow knew before anyone else and made sure groceries appeared on their doorstep. When a young couple struggled to pay medical bills after their first child was born, an anonymous envelope filled with cash mysteriously arrived in their mailbox. No one ever connected those quiet acts of generosity to Eleanor because she never wanted anyone to know. She believed that kindness lost something precious the moment it expected recognition. To the outside world, she looked like an ordinary retired grandmother living on a fixed income, grateful for what little she had. That image was so convincing that almost everyone accepted it without question, including the people who shared her last name. Jason Brooks had spent most of his life believing he understood his mother. At 50 years old, he considered himself a practical man who had worked hard for everything he owned. But life had changed quickly. After spending nearly 25 years with the same manufacturing company, a sudden restructuring eliminated his position, leaving him unemployed with mounting bills and shrinking savings. Every morning began with another rejection email, another unanswered job application, or another reminder that his mortgage payment was overdue. The pressure slowly replaced confidence with frustration, and frustration gradually turned into desperation. Jason convinced himself that his family's future depended on making difficult decisions before everything collapsed around them. Looking at his mother's modest lifestyle, he saw only a small house that could be sold, a few pieces of old furniture, and a retirement that seemed barely enough to support one elderly woman. He never imagined there could be anything more because Eleanor had spent decades making certain there wasn't a single outward sign of extraordinary wealth. Even as a child, Jason had watched his parents repair old appliances instead of buying new ones, clip coupons before shopping, and refuse unnecessary luxuries. Those habits became the foundation of everything he believed about his family's financial situation, never realizing they weren't signs of necessity, but deliberate choices made by parents who valued humility more than status. Standing beside Jason through every difficult decision was his wife, Melissa Brooks, a woman whose dreams had always been larger than the life she believed they were living. Melissa wasn't cruel by nature, but she measured success in ways Eleanor never had. She admired beautiful homes, expensive renovations, luxury vacations, and the admiration that came with appearing successful. As Jason's unemployment stretched from weeks into months, Melissa became increasingly convinced that Eleanor's old house represented their only realistic chance to escape financial disaster. She argued that an assisted living facility would provide better care while allowing them to sell the property and finally regain control of their future. In Melissa's mind, it wasn't heartless, it was practical. Yet every time Eleanor quietly refused to discuss selling the house, Melissa grew more convinced that the elderly widow simply didn't understand how serious their situation had become. Neither Jason nor Melissa stopped to ask a question that, in hindsight, seemed almost impossible to ignore. Why would a woman who appeared to have so little remain so calm while facing so much pressure? Why didn't she argue when they packed her suitcase? Why didn't she plead for another chance or reveal some hidden savings if she truly had nowhere else to go? And why? Only hours after Eleanor disappeared, would some of the most respected attorneys, influential developers, and successful businessmen in the county begin searching for an elderly woman everyone else believed had just become homeless? Those questions would soon lead to a discovery hidden inside a forgotten envelope that had remained unopened for more than 40 years, waiting patiently for the day someone finally realized who Eleanor Brooks had truly been all along. 40 years before anyone questioned who Eleanor Brooks really was, she and her husband, George Brooks, were simply another hard-working American couple trying to build a future that would outlive them. George wasn't a wealthy businessman, nor was Eleanor born into privilege. They lived paycheck to paycheck during the early years of their marriage, raising Jason while carefully stretching every dollar they earned. But George possessed one rare quality that few people appreciated at the time. While others chased opportunities everyone could already see, he quietly searched for value where no one else was looking. During long weekend drives through the outskirts of their growing Ohio town, George noticed forgotten parcels of farmland, abandoned commercial lots, and neglected properties that investors dismissed as worthless. Friends laughed when he spent their limited savings buying land covered in weeds instead of investing in fashionable neighborhoods everyone believed would become the next big thing. More than once, neighbors told Eleanor that her husband was throwing away money they couldn't afford to lose. Yet Eleanor never complained. She trusted George completely because she knew every decision he made came from patience rather than greed. Together they purchased one overlooked property after another, never expecting overnight success. They believed that if they worked honestly, stayed patient, and thought decades ahead instead of months ahead, time itself would become their greatest investment. Years slowly passed, and the town began changing in ways almost no one could have predicted. New highways were built where empty fields had once stretched for miles. Shopping centers appeared where abandoned farmland had stood untouched for generations. Housing developments expanded farther and farther beyond the original city limits, swallowing land that investors had ignored for decades. One by one, the forgotten properties George and Eleanor had quietly accumulated became some of the most valuable real estate in the county. Yet if anyone expected the Brooks family to celebrate their growing fortune with luxury homes or extravagant lifestyles, they would have been disappointed. George continued driving the same pickup truck until it could barely stay on the road. Eleanor still clipped coupons from the Sunday newspaper, compared grocery prices aisle by aisle, and insisted on repairing furniture instead of replacing it. When friends asked why they lived so modestly despite obvious financial stability, George would simply smile and say that money should create freedom, not attention. He often reminded Eleanor that the moment wealth became something you needed to prove, it had already begun controlling you instead of serving you. Those words stayed with her long after his voice was gone, becoming the quiet promise that would shape every decision she made for the rest of her life. When George Brooks passed away after a brief illness, Eleanor experienced a loss that no amount of money could soften. The man who had shared every dream, every sacrifice, and every quiet victory was suddenly gone, leaving behind memories far more valuable than the fortune they had built together. In the weeks following his funeral, Eleanor met privately with their longtime attorney, Harold Whitmore, an elderly lawyer who had handled the Brooks family's legal affairs since the very first land purchase decades earlier. Inside Harold's office sat thick folders containing property deeds, trust agreements, business records, and handwritten notes that documented a lifetime of careful planning. George had anticipated that Eleanor might one day face pressure from people who judged success by appearances rather than character. So he had created a carefully structured family trust designed to protect their assets for generations. Before signing the final documents, Eleanor made a promise that surprised even Harold. She promised she would never allow wealth to change the person George had fallen in love with. She would remain in the same modest house. She would continue shopping at the local grocery store instead of expensive markets. She would drive her aging sedan until it could no longer be repaired. She would volunteer at churches without seeking recognition. Most importantly, she would use their blessings to quietly lift others without ever expecting applause in return. And that is exactly how Eleanor lived for the next several decades. Every month, anonymous donations quietly appeared at churches helping families facing impossible medical bills. Scholarships mysteriously covered college tuition for hardworking students who had nearly given up on higher education. Local food banks occasionally received generous contributions from donors who refused to reveal their identities. Small businesses struggling after storms or unexpected disasters somehow found enough financial support to reopen their doors. Eleanor never attended ribbon-cutting ceremonies, never accepted plaques, and never allowed anyone to publicly thank her. To the people receiving help, she was invisible by choice. Meanwhile, Jason grew older believing exactly what his parents wanted him to believe. He assumed they had saved responsibly for retirement, but possessed nothing extraordinary beyond their modest home and careful budgeting. Even Melissa, who often dreamed of larger houses and a more luxurious lifestyle, never questioned the appearance Eleanor had carefully maintained for more than 40 years. Only Harold Whitmore knew the complete truth. Locked inside his office safe rested documents proving that Eleanor Brooks quietly controlled a real estate portfolio worth tens of millions of dollars through the family trust George had established long ago. To everyone else, including neighbors, church friends, business owners, and even her own son, Eleanor remained nothing more than a kind elderly widow living on what they assumed was a modest Social Security check. That carefully protected secret might have remained hidden forever, if life hadn't taken an unexpected turn the day Jason Brooks lost his job, setting into motion a chain of decisions that would test the very foundation of his family. Jason Brooks had always believed that hard work could solve almost any problem. For years, that belief had carried him through long shifts, unexpected setbacks, and the everyday responsibilities of providing for his family. But the confidence he had spent decades building began to disappear the morning his employer announced another round of layoffs. At first, Jason told himself it was only temporary. He polished his resume, reached out to former colleagues, and applied for every position that matched his experience. Days turned into weeks, and weeks quietly became months. Every rejection email chipped away at the optimism he tried so hard to protect. Savings that had once seemed reassuring began disappearing faster than he ever imagined possible. The mortgage payment that had never worried him suddenly became impossible to ignore. Credit card balances climbed higher every month. Utility notices arrived with alarming regularity, and the phone rang constantly with reminders of bills that could no longer be postponed. Jason stopped sleeping through the night. He found himself sitting alone in the living room after midnight, staring at unpaid statements spread across the coffee table, wondering how everything had unraveled so quickly. The future he had spent years building now felt frighteningly uncertain, and with every passing week, the pressure inside his home became impossible to escape. Melissa Brooks felt that pressure just as deeply, but she responded to it very differently. While Jason carried the weight of failure in silence, Melissa searched desperately for practical solutions, even if those solutions required painful decisions. Every conversation eventually circled back to the same subject: their debts, their shrinking bank account, their overdue mortgage, their fear of losing everything they had worked for. What began as worried discussions slowly transformed into heated arguments that seemed to happen almost every evening. Melissa couldn't understand why Jason refused to consider what she believed was the obvious answer standing right in front of them. Eleanor's house had become, in her mind, the one asset capable of rescuing their family before it was too late. She argued that Eleanor was growing older every year and would eventually need additional care anyway. A respected nursing facility, she insisted, would provide comfort, medical attention, and companionship while allowing the family to sell the property and finally regain financial stability. The more Melissa repeated the idea, the more reasonable it began to sound to Jason. What started as an uncomfortable suggestion slowly evolved into a plan they convinced themselves was both responsible and necessary. Without realizing it, they stopped seeing Eleanor as a mother who deserved patience and respect. Instead, they began seeing her as the final obstacle standing between them and the financial relief they desperately wanted. When Jason finally approached Eleanor with the paperwork, he expected hesitation. He expected questions. He even prepared himself for tears. Instead, Eleanor quietly listened as her son explained why moving into a nursing facility would supposedly be the best decision for everyone involved. She read every page carefully before placing the documents back on the table with remarkable calm. Then she looked into Jason's eyes with the same gentle expression she had worn throughout his childhood and softly declined to sign. There was no anger in her voice, no accusation, no attempt to embarrass him or remind him of everything she and George had sacrificed over the years. She simply said that she couldn't agree to sell the house. Jason interpreted her refusal as stubbornness. Melissa called it selfishness. Neither of them realized Eleanor's decision had nothing to do with protecting the building itself. The modest house represented something far greater than wood, bricks, and old memories. Hidden beneath layers of legal documents, family trusts, and decades of careful planning was a responsibility George had entrusted to her alone. Signing those papers would have triggered consequences neither Jason nor Melissa could begin to imagine. Eleanor understood exactly what was at stake, but she also knew that revealing the truth in that moment would only solve a financial problem without teaching the lesson life was about to place before them. A cold rain fell across the neighborhood a few days later as Jason carried his mother's worn brown suitcase to the front porch. The same suitcase Eleanor had packed for family vacations years earlier now held only a few changes of clothes, her favorite Bible, several framed photographs, and the old leather album she had protected for decades. Melissa stood inside the doorway with folded arms, convincing herself they were doing what had to be done. Across the street, neighbors watched through rain-covered windows, sensing that something deeply painful was unfolding but choosing to remain silent. No one knew what to say as Jason quietly placed the suitcase beside the front steps. A locksmith arrived only minutes later. Without a word, the locks were replaced. The sound of the new deadbolt clicking into place echoed through the quiet street with heartbreaking finality. Eleanor stepped onto the porch carrying herself with remarkable dignity despite the betrayal unfolding before her. She looked at the home where she had shared a lifetime with George, where she had raised Jason, celebrated birthdays, mourned losses, and quietly honored every promise she had ever made. Then she bent down, lifted her suitcase with both hands, held the old photo album close against her chest, and slowly walked toward the sidewalk. She never argued. She never begged. She never reminded Jason of the countless nights she had stayed awake caring for him when he was sick, or the sacrifices she and George had made to give him opportunities they never had. As she reached the edge of the driveway, she paused only long enough to whisper words so soft that almost no one heard them. "They'll understand soon enough." Then she continued walking into the rain without turning back. Inside the house, Jason and Melissa believed the hardest part of their decision was finally over. They talked about contacting a real estate agent, making renovations, and calculating how much the property might sell for in the current market. For the first time in months, they allowed themselves to believe their financial nightmare was finally coming to an end. They had no idea that, less than 24 hours later, their quiet suburban street would be filled with sleek black luxury SUVs carrying attorneys, corporate executives, and real estate professionals from across the state. People searching for one elderly woman whose disappearance had suddenly become the most urgent matter in the county. The silence inside Jason Brooks' home didn't last long. Early the following morning, while Melissa stood in the kitchen scrolling through listings for expensive home renovations, Jason's phone rang from an unfamiliar number. He glanced at the screen, sighed heavily, and almost ignored it. Over the past several months, unknown numbers had become part of his daily routine. Collection agencies, overdue account reminders, and lenders asking when another payment might be made had all become painfully familiar. Assuming this was simply another creditor, Jason reluctantly answered with the exhausted voice of someone expecting another difficult conversation. But instead of demanding money, the calm, professional voice on the other end introduced himself as Harold Whitmore, senior partner at Whitmore, Langford & Associates, one of the oldest and most respected law firms in the state. Jason immediately recognized the name. He vaguely remembered Harold from childhood, though he hadn't seen the elderly attorney in years. Before Jason could ask why he was calling, Harold interrupted with a single question spoken slowly enough that every word seemed to carry unusual weight. "Mr. Brooks, where is Mrs. Eleanor Brooks?" Jason frowned, confused by both the urgency and the formality in the attorney's voice. He casually explained that his mother had left the house the previous afternoon and was probably staying somewhere temporarily. Several seconds of complete silence followed before Harold quietly replied, "I'm afraid you don't understand the seriousness of this situation. We need to locate your mother immediately." Jason's heartbeat quickened as Harold explained that Eleanor had failed to appear for a long-scheduled legal meeting that morning, something that had never happened before. During the past 40 years, Eleanor Brooks had missed only one appointment with the firm, and that absence had been because she was sitting beside George in a hospital room during the final days of his life. Harold wasn't calling out of curiosity. He was calling because Eleanor's disappearance had unexpectedly placed a series of legal responsibilities in jeopardy, responsibilities involving properties, trusts, and agreements that required her personal authorization. Jason listened in growing confusion. Properties? Trusts? Legal responsibilities? None of it made sense. His mother barely spent money on herself. She still shopped at discount grocery stores, wore coats older than some of her neighbors' children, and insisted on repairing appliances instead of replacing them. There had to be some misunderstanding. Harold ended the call with one final request. "If you hear from your mother, contact me immediately. Several people are already on their way to your neighborhood." Jason barely had time to process those words before he noticed unfamiliar vehicles slowly entering the street outside his front window. Within the next 2 hours, the quiet neighborhood transformed into something no one had ever witnessed before. One black luxury SUV became 3, then 5. Expensive sedans lined both sides of the street as sharply dressed attorneys, real estate executives, financial advisors, surveyors, and local government officials stepped onto the sidewalks carrying leather briefcases and thick document folders. Curious neighbors gathered outside, whispering among themselves as cameras from local news stations appeared at the end of the block, trying to understand why so many influential people had suddenly arrived in an ordinary suburban neighborhood. Jason stepped onto his porch, stunned as one businessman politely approached and asked the same question Harold Whitmore had asked earlier that morning. "Have you seen Mrs. Eleanor Brooks?" Another attorney introduced himself before explaining that several important transactions affecting multiple commercial developments had been delayed because Eleanor could not be located. A city planning official quietly mentioned that upcoming infrastructure projects depended upon agreements requiring Eleanor's personal approval. Jason stared in disbelief. None of these conversations made sense. His mother wasn't a developer. She wasn't a corporate executive. She wasn't a politician. She was simply an elderly widow who spent her weekends volunteering at church food drives. Yet every important person arriving on his street seemed to know exactly who she was. As confusion spread through the neighborhood, Harold Whitmore arrived carrying a weathered leather briefcase that looked almost as old as the man himself. His face showed none of the panic everyone else displayed, only quiet disappointment. Without saying much, he entered Jason's living room and carefully placed several thick binders across the dining room table. The faded folders contained property deeds dating back more than 4 decades, original land surveys signed by George Brooks, corporate filings, trust agreements, tax records, and handwritten notes documenting investments that stretched across nearly half a century. Harold slowly opened the oldest binder, revealing yellowed maps of the town long before shopping centers, apartment complexes, and office buildings existed. One by one, he traced the boundaries with his finger, explaining how George and Eleanor had quietly purchased neglected parcels of land when almost everyone else dismissed them as worthless. They had never chased attention or recognition. They had simply seen possibilities others overlooked. As highways expanded, neighborhoods grew, and businesses moved into the area, those forgotten parcels became some of the most valuable real estate in the county. George had anticipated every stage of that growth with remarkable patience, placing each acquisition into a carefully structured family trust designed to protect the properties for generations rather than quick profits. Then Harold opened the final folder, the one Eleanor had guarded more carefully than anything else after George's passing. Inside rested the complete trust portfolio. Jason's hands began trembling as he turned page after page. Shopping centers carrying different corporate names were listed among the trust's holdings. Apartment communities he had driven past his entire life appeared one after another. Office buildings housing successful companies. Medical plazas. Retail developments. Rental properties stretching across multiple districts. Even several luxury homes built years after George's death sat on land that remained under long-term lease agreements controlled by the Brooks family trust. The modest neighborhood Jason had always believed belonged to dozens of unrelated property owners had quietly grown around land his parents had purchased decades earlier. His mother hadn't simply owned the house he had forced her to leave. Through the trust George established and Eleanor faithfully protected, she controlled nearly every major parcel of commercial land surrounding the entire neighborhood. The restaurants where families gathered every weekend. The grocery store where Eleanor clipped coupons despite quietly owning the land beneath it. The office buildings employing hundreds of people. Even the streets and developments that had transformed the once-forgotten farmland into one of the county's most desirable communities all traced back to decisions George and Eleanor had made 40 years earlier. Jason felt the room begin to spin. Every assumption he had made about his parents collapsed in a matter of minutes. The modest furniture, the old sedan, the simple clothes, the carefully repaired appliances, the quiet generosity that never asked for recognition. None of it had been the result of financial necessity. It had been a choice. Eleanor Brooks had spent decades proving that character mattered more than appearances while protecting a legacy far greater than anyone imagined. The painful truth settled over Jason with overwhelming force. In his desperation to solve his financial problems, he had thrown out the one person who held the future of his family in her hands. And now, no one knew where she was. Jason Brooks had never driven through his town feeling so completely lost. Every familiar street suddenly carried a different meaning now that he knew who his mother truly was. The grocery store where she smiled at cashiers by name stood on land she quietly owned. The pharmacy where she picked up her prescriptions every month paid rent into a trust she had protected for decades. Even the medical clinic where George Brooks had spent his final days stood on property that had once been dismissed as worthless farmland before George saw possibilities no one else could imagine. Yet none of those discoveries mattered anymore. Jason wasn't searching for deeds or trust documents. He was searching for his mother. Alongside him sat Melissa Brooks, unusually quiet as they visited church after church, community centers, shelters, and every place Eleanor had ever volunteered. They stopped at food banks where volunteers immediately recognized Eleanor's photograph. They visited neighborhood ministries where pastors remembered the gentle widow who never missed an opportunity to help someone in need. Everywhere they went, people spoke about Eleanor with remarkable affection, but no one seemed interested in discussing her wealth. Instead, they described a woman who listened without judgment, who encouraged struggling parents, who quietly paid utility bills for families facing impossible choices, and who somehow appeared whenever someone felt forgotten. Jason realized with growing shame that complete strangers seemed to understand his mother's heart better than he ever had. Every kind word he heard became another painful reminder that he had measured Eleanor by what he assumed she owned instead of the person she had spent a lifetime becoming. Late that afternoon, one elderly pastor quietly suggested they visit a small homeless shelter on the edge of town, explaining that Eleanor occasionally spent time there preparing evening meals. Jason struggled to believe his mother would choose to be there after everything she had endured only 24 hours earlier, but desperation left little room for doubt. As he and Melissa stepped inside the modest brick building, the aroma of fresh soup and homemade bread filled the air. Volunteers moved from table to table greeting guests by name, while families facing difficult seasons shared quiet conversations over warm meals. Near the serving line, wearing the same simple coat she had left home in, stood Eleanor Brooks. She smiled warmly as she carefully filled bowls with soup, gently encouraging an elderly veteran to take an extra piece of bread before making her way toward a young mother trying to comfort two exhausted children. No one inside the shelter treated Eleanor like a wealthy landowner because no one there knew she possessed extraordinary wealth. To them, she was simply Miss Eleanor, the kind woman who arrived every week with homemade desserts, remembered birthdays, and stayed long after everyone else had gone home to help clean the kitchen. Watching from across the room, Jason felt tears forming as he realized his mother hadn't spent the previous night consumed by bitterness or planning revenge. While he had been terrified of lawsuits, courtrooms, and public humiliation, Eleanor had quietly returned to doing exactly what she had always done, serving people who needed kindness more than they needed to know her name. For several long moments, Jason couldn't bring himself to move. Melissa stood beside him with tears running silently down her face, overwhelmed by the contrast between the woman they had abandoned and the woman standing before them now. Eventually, Eleanor noticed them waiting near the entrance. She paused only briefly before setting down the serving spoon and walking toward them with the same calm expression she had carried throughout her life. There was no anger in her eyes, no satisfaction at seeing them broken by the truth, no bitterness over the humiliation they deserved. She simply looked at her son with the quiet compassion of a mother whose love had survived even the deepest betrayal. Jason tried to speak, but every sentence he had rehearsed disappeared the moment he stood before her. The apology that finally emerged was interrupted by tears he could no longer control. He admitted everything: the fear after losing his job, the financial pressure, the terrible decisions, the shame that had followed every painful discovery since Harold Whitmore opened those old files. Melissa apologized as well, confessing that she had become so focused on saving their future that she had forgotten the value of the person standing in front of them. Neither of them asked about the trust. Neither mentioned the land or the fortune. In that moment, none of it seemed important anymore. They simply wanted the chance to undo the hurt they had caused. Eleanor listened without interrupting until the silence returned once more. Then, with the same gentle voice that had comforted Jason throughout his childhood, she asked a question so simple that neither he nor Melissa could answer it. "If I had truly been poor, would you still have wanted me?" The words settled over them with a weight greater than any legal document Harold Whitmore had placed on the dining room table. Jason lowered his head, unable to meet his mother's eyes because he already knew the honest answer. Only after discovering her wealth had he raced through the town searching for her. Only after learning what she owned had he fully understood what he had lost. The realization was almost unbearable. Eleanor wasn't asking about property or inheritance. She was asking whether her worth as a mother had depended on the size of her bank account, whether her love had become valuable only after it carried a price tag, whether the woman who had sacrificed her entire life for her family would still have been welcome if she had possessed nothing beyond the worn suitcase she carried away from her own front porch. Jason remained silent because there was nothing he could say that would erase the truth. Sometimes the hardest judgments are never spoken by a courtroom or written into law. Sometimes they come in the form of a single question that forces us to confront the person we have become. Weeks passed, but the story of Eleanor Brooks quietly spread throughout the community in ways no newspaper headline could ever fully capture. People who had known her for years began discovering pieces of her life they had never seen before. Churches learned that anonymous donations keeping their food pantries open during difficult winters had come from the same woman who faithfully stacked chairs after every community dinner. Local schools discovered that scholarship funds helping hard-working students attend college had been established through gifts Eleanor insisted should never carry her name. Families remembered mysterious envelopes that had appeared during medical emergencies, just when hope seemed impossible to find. Business owners recalled receiving unexpected assistance after fires, floods, or economic downturns threatened to close their doors forever. One by one, stories emerged that painted a picture far richer than any balance sheet ever could. Harold Whitmore watched those stories unfold with quiet satisfaction because he had promised George Brooks decades earlier that the family's legacy would never be measured by the size of its fortune, but by the number of lives it quietly lifted along the way. Eleanor had honored that promise every single day, never asking for recognition, never expecting applause, and never allowing generosity to become a performance. The remarkable truth was that thousands of people had benefited from her kindness without ever realizing the gentle widow they greeted at church every Sunday had been changing lives long before they knew her name. Not long afterward, Eleanor invited Harold Whitmore, Jason Brooks, and Melissa Brooks to the same law office where George had once signed the original trust documents more than 40 years earlier. Jason entered the conference room carrying a mixture of hope and uncertainty, fully expecting his mother to discuss inheritances, ownership transfers, or the future of the family estate. Instead, Eleanor calmly presented a new set of legal documents that reflected everything she and George had always believed. A large portion of the Brooks Family Trust would now fund a permanent charitable foundation dedicated to helping struggling seniors remain in their homes, supporting working families facing financial hardship, providing educational scholarships, and strengthening community programs across the county. The properties George had carefully acquired decades earlier would continue generating income, but that income would now improve the lives of people who might otherwise be forgotten. Harold carefully explained that the foundation had been designed to continue serving the community long after Eleanor was gone, ensuring that the values she and George cherished would outlive every building, every shopping center, and every piece of land they had ever owned. It was one final reminder that true success is measured not by what we keep, but by what we leave behind for others. Then Eleanor turned toward Jason. The room became completely silent as he waited to hear whether he had permanently lost everything. Eleanor smiled gently before explaining that she had not removed him from the family's future. She had simply changed the path required to reach it. Jason would receive no immediate fortune, no valuable properties, and no shortcut to the wealth his parents had spent a lifetime protecting. Instead, if he hoped to one day oversee any part of the Brooks Family Trust, he would first spend several years serving the very community his mother had quietly supported for decades. He would volunteer at homeless shelters, assist food banks, mentor struggling families, and dedicate himself to helping people without expecting anything in return. Only after demonstrating consistent compassion, humility, integrity, and selfless service would Harold Whitmore and the Trust's independent board review whether Jason had become the kind of man George Brooks always hoped his son would be. Tears filled Jason's eyes, not because he felt punished, but because, for the first time in his life, he understood what his parents had been trying to teach him all along. Wealth could build neighborhoods, purchase land, and create opportunity, but character was the only inheritance capable of lasting for generations. Years later, people across the community would remember Eleanor Brooks for many different reasons. Some remembered the warm meals she served without asking questions. Others remembered the scholarships that changed their children's futures. Many remembered the quiet encouragement she offered during the darkest seasons of their lives. Very few remembered how much land she owned, because that had never been the most remarkable part of her story. The greatest inheritance Eleanor left behind wasn't the shopping centers, the office buildings, the apartment complexes, or even the neighborhood itself. It was the timeless lesson that a person's worth should never be measured by the size of a bank account, the value of a home, or the appearance of success. Respect, compassion, and love should exist long before anyone discovers what someone owns. Money may reveal people's intentions, but character reveals their true identity. And perhaps that is why Eleanor never told the world who she really was. She wanted to know who would still choose kindness if there were nothing to gain. So now we'd like to hear from you. If you discovered that your elderly parents secretly owned everything, would your love have changed? Or should it have never depended on money in the first place? Share your thoughts in the comments below because your perspective could encourage someone facing a similar situation today. And if this story touched your heart, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to Unseen Mind Lab, and turn on notifications so you never miss another unforgettable story about family, betrayal, redemption, and the life-changing consequences of the choices we make. Until next time, remember that the greatest fortunes are rarely the ones counted in dollars. They're the ones measured by the lives we choose to change.